Did it resist? The captain asked. It's a male, and as you already guessed, it's sentient. So no, he didn't resist, replied the ship's veterinarian, a shallow named Jinta from V. Captain Anticton rolled his eyes. He forgave the woman for her poor attitude. Her race of graceful two-armed four-legged Yulet were a law-abiding sort of people. They could never be comfortable in the exotic animal and slave trade, even when their job was only to keep the merchandise alive and in good health. It was fortuitous then that she didn't have much of a choice being merchandise herself. That wasn't to say that she was for sale, only that she wouldn't be for sale until a better veterinarian came along. A tiny whelp like that, he wouldn't have stood much chance. He must be smarter than he looks, the captain said with a chuckle. Be grateful to it, since you don't need to patch it up. You can have the rest of the day to yourself unless something come up. The short fur on her back, brown, laced with white, lowered a bit. He wasn't used to seeing her without her hackles up at all times. He wondered if it meant he was going soft. He'd have to extend her hours tomorrow to make up for it. There is something you should know about him, she added before turning to leave, her tone brighter than normal. He seems like a nice young man, but I think he could have done more harm than you suspect had he resisted. He's heavily muscled, much more so than even a high-grav world would require. And he's a carnivore. That gave the captain pause. Carnivorous species were a rarity in the universe, and sentient ones were even rarer still. In fact, he couldn't think of a single intelligent species that routinely chose to eat the flesh of other creatures, except for one. Glancing to the deck plates beneath his broad hooves, he thought immediately of the lithe predator lurking in its cell deep in the bowels of his vessel, a night beast from a Class 11 death world. Its sentience was highly debatable. Captain Anticon ran his thick tongue over his blunt teeth. He didn't think this hairless whelp was anything like that at all. That's not possible, he said. Our newest guest, what did he call himself? Human, said the vet, named Stephen. The human has herbivore teeth. I don't see how he could possibly be a carnivore. Up close he did not display his teeth much, but when he did I noticed a set of fangs, very small, almost like the rest of his teeth, but there, she pointed to the space between her incisors and molars, 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom, little fangs. Really, he didn't believe her. What else? Don't tell me you didn't notice the way it stares. Its 2 eyes, how do they make you feel? Deeply, instinctively fearful, creeped out might be a better word. The thing was tiny, chest high, and when I was trying to figure out what to feed it, the Jinta continued, I was shocked to discover that fully 1/2 of the rations in its craft by calorie content were comprised of animal protein. She looked sick. He could sympathize. It was one thing to talk about eating flesh in an academic sense, but to actually have to see an animal's carcass dressed for consumption up close, disgusting. Point taken, he said. I'll be careful around it. That meant he'd be armed and wouldn't hesitate to shoot at novelties like a new species were worth money, but not that much, not enough to risk his life. He might even just kill it for fun. Every time he went on vacation he spent more money than the creature was probably worth on more pointless and less satisfying pursuits. There is another thing to be wary of, said Aunt Ticton, thinking aloud. If he has a significant amount of musculature he doesn't need, he might be some kind of super soldier engineered to be that way. Maybe, said the vet. There's no way for me to confirm or refute that, but it is certainly a possibility. So we have a carnivorous super soldier locked a bunk, not even a cell, let alone a reinforced cell. That's just great. Add that to the night beast caged in the BGE, and it's a wonder why we all aren't dead 10 times over already. Well, in fairness, Sten seems really nice, said the vet. Maybe make them fight, chuckled the ship's executive officer. He had walked in to begin his shift, while the captain and Jinta had been speaking. He smiled. It must be pretty important, so I doubt they'll start right away. I've got a super predator and possible super soldier on my ship. The human was probably part of some alien invasion force heading for one of the fringe territories. His ship looked exactly like an orbital drop pod with a warp field generator attached, doesn't it? There was some evidence that it was a multi-staged craft. Yes, the drive section may have been designed to be discarded in order to allow planetary entry of the capsule, but there is the question of why it would travel using a convoy warp bubble when it has a perfectly good drive of its own which it won't use and then discard before planetfall. Could be standardization of design, but I really doubt that. But if that's not the case, then we're back to the question of range, he huffed, and he lifted his snout from his hand where it had been buried in frustration. And there were no weapons aboard his craft, said Mishi, though he was wearing a surprisingly strong set of armor. It appears to be impervious to vacuum, radiation, heat, cold, small arms fire, large arms fire, poisonous atmospheres, and hostile wildlife, among other things. The thing is tough, but flexible. His people have that kind of technology. Not really, no, the EXO explained, gesturing a tentacle in the negative. Not in the sense that you mean. It's not terribly advanced. Any of the galactic races could make something like That they just couldn't make use of it. It took 4 of us just to drag it to the cargo hold. The captain's expression went flat and he was wearing it. Yes, he was in here, Anton asked, pointing to the deck. Not out on some extravehicular excursion. Yes, in here. The EXO pulled his proboscis tightly shut, the equivalent of pursing his lips. It seems that he didn't like where this conversation was going either. A thought occurred to the captain then. Just how in the 7 hells of Borgen did you even get him out of it? Oh, we asked him to remove it. Asked. Yes, he's very nice. I don't give a how nice he is. I just Marsha hastened to interrupt. Sir, I don't think he knows he's been abducted into slavery. That was just plain dumb. His assessment of this being's race fell a few notches. On the other hand, it was entirely possible that this genetic freak was not representative of its people. In fact, it was entirely likely he wasn't. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. If this was a super soldier on its way to war, the thing had only to sit in its pod, land, and fight. It didn't need to be very smart, which might have contributed to why its computer was destroyed, explained how it couldn't find its way back, and explained why it didn't know it was a piece of merchandise. Heck, the thing was probably so dumb that its people wouldn't have even bothered to give it a gun until after it had landed and had a safe direction in which to point it. It was probably programmed to be compliant and take orders, which was why it seemed to get along well with everyone. One last thing before I go, sir, the vet said meekly. He had forgotten that Tur was even standing there. It looks similar to what? She stuttered softly. Spit it out, he said impatiently, motioning for her to continue. That thing, she whispered, pointing to the deck below her feet. The captain and EXO each sucked in a breath of air. He hadn't thought about it, but the more he did, the more the captain realized she was right. They were both bipedal tetrapods. For one, it was an efficient but inherently unstable design suited for organisms that were either on the move or at rest, and nowhere in between. They were both mostly ball. For another, their heads were differently shaped, but not nearly as much as any 2 other races might have been. The coloration was different. This human was a pale mottled cream color, and night beasts generally were anywhere from light blue to purple to jet black. They were the same general height from heel to scalp, though the human might have been taller and bulkier actually. And then there were their eyes forward-facing like gun barrels aimed right at you, bright and dangerous. He hoped the humans didn't glow at night like the beasts did. The thought sent a chill down his spine. On the other hand, comparing the 2 felt just plain stupid. Engineered soldier or not, Steven was one step above a friendly pet and came from a people with adequate technology. If this were a true case of convergent evolution, his people would also have to have been from a Class 11 death world, almost exactly like Nyx. That simply couldn't be, because death worlds could not produce true sentient, only feral monstrosities. The captain rolled his eyes and sighed internally. He would still perform his due diligence and try his best to determine if this thing posed any real risks, even if he was highly skeptical. XO, is it safe to talk to the human? He asked. I think so, said Mari with Jinta nodding in agreement. His translator is working great now, and I was chatting with him for a bit. Told him I had to lock him in his room for operational security reasons. He didn't have the clearance to be wandering about. I think he bought it. After all we've learned of him, I wouldn't let slip that he's anything other than a guest. He might not be as compliant. The captain thought a moment. Ginter, your evening is cancelled. You'll start developing poisons and sedatives to use on this thing immediately. Airborne, but harmless to everyone else. If possible, go now. The woman nodded and slowly trotted off the bridge, even her hoofbeats sounding dejected. I'm going to go have a chat with Steven before I retire for the evening, said Captain Ankton. With that, he stood from his chair and left without another word. The captain pulled up the one chair in the cell and took a seat across from him. Their guest lounged on his padded bunk. It was meant to be uncomfortably small, but with him it seemed decadently large. His unusual coverings were folded up behind him as a pillow, and a blanket covered him from his waist to his toes. His chest and arms were exposed, showing off his substantial musculature. Less than a meter of space stood between them in the padded cell. Nice place you got here, said the human. I stayed on a terrestrial ship once, and they've got nothing on you guys compared to our spacecraft. Well, this ship is like a floating palace. How do you do it? The captain certainly hadn't expected to be praised for the accommodations, but given its small stature and the confines of the craft they found him in, he should not have been surprised. Well, we value our guests and strive to provide the best we can offer for them, he replied, trying his best to sound sincere. Gods and lords, this thing was stupid, but the bunks for our crew are what you might typically find on any military or patrol spacecraft. We got lucky, evolving intelligence to avoid them, and we were pretty safe building our tree villages high up off the ground where no predator could reach us. You seem to have a lot of muscle mass, the captain said. He showed his own arm to the man, spreading his thick layer of feathers flat. It looked spindly next to Stephen's, though it was much longer and attached to his taller frame. Well, it's necessary for our lifestyle, Stephen said. I imagine you evolved from six-legged ground dwellers, but we humans need the extra muscle to support our entire weight on only two legs, to climb trees, to jump from one tree to another, and to grab things and lift our entire body weight up on a single hand if necessary. And our world has pretty high gravity compared to here. I think I was once told that if our gravity was any higher we could never have achieved early spaceflight with chemical rockets. Makes sense, the captain said. How high is your gravity anyway? I don't know space units or whatever, but a meter is this long, Stephen said, indicating a height on the bulkhead. The captain made a note. And the acceleration of gravity at my planet's sea level is 9.8 of those per second squared. Does that help? And a second is 123. The captain noted the tempo of the man's counting and plugged that and the other information into his data pad and waited for his ship's AI to do the calculations. Though a rough approximation, the results were staggering. 4.2 galactic standard gravities. Unbelievable. Still, that the human was strong told him nothing. They already knew that just from the weight of his environmental suit. That didn't mean that he or his people were dangerous, nor did anything else he had learned thus far, aside from some peculiarity with their language. Those types of errors were bound to crop up from time to time and should always be taken with a lick of salt. Wars had been started over worse and sometime better translations. You seem like a very intelligent, very reasonable, and utterly harmless being, Stephen, he told the human, and I am very glad to have rescued you. He meant that the thing would fetch a fortune. As a nobleman's personal acrobat he could be wonderfully entertaining to watch. Why, thank you, the other man replied with a laugh. I'm glad you rescued me too. What happens now? Oh well, if you can tell us where you live we can get you back home, he replied. The post-primitive explorer could never know, at least in any system Antic-Ton could recognize the astronomical coordinates of its home star. It was a safe offer. Otherwise we take you somewhere to be processed into the galactic community, and we ultimately set you up with a job. No one eats for free, of course, the other man said, nodding. But I don't know where my world is. Antic-Ton was quite glad and not at all surprised to hear that it would make things a whole lot less awkward if he didn't have to refuse to take Stephen home. Nevertheless he would play along. That's not going to make this easy. Is there anything you can tell us about where your world is? He placed a hand on the smaller man's shoulder and gave his best comforting expression. What if I gave you a galaxy map to look at? No, that won't help. It means nothing to me, the human said, scratching its face again. Oh well, said the captain, using body language to indicate his own helplessness. The human probably wouldn't understand it, but it was a natural response. He really honestly couldn't do anything to help him, and thankfully Stephen was perfectly willing to accept that, which felt rather oddly convenient. Are you sure you don't want to see a galaxy map? Antic-Ton asked, pulling one up on his data pad. I can show you where we picked you up. Well, I can certainly take a look, Stephen said, as the captain turned the map on the data pad to face him, a single point clearly marked. After a moment the human replied, no, this doesn't help at all. Sorry, do you know maybe the distance and direction you have traveled or were supposed to have traveled? The captain asked, prodding a little further. No, the other man said, shaking his head. No idea. The ship was fully automated. I was just inside it as a publicity stunt more than anything, so the human government could say we sent a man further than ever before with this new starship engine and brought him home safely. Too bad they messed up on the second part. Am I right? Indeed. The captain definitely began to feel like something just wasn't adding up. There was no way this being as smart as it was didn't know how far it had traveled. Even if it couldn't tell the direction, there would have been planning for months for a newly advanced people's first expedition past their solar system. He would have known the distance and probably the direction too. He would have had to have seen a galaxy map of some kind, even just a section of it. The captain could have zoomed into a 200 light-year radius of where they found him, and Stephen should have been able to orient himself. Space was three-dimensional, but the galaxy was on a plane. Damn it, common celestial landmarks weren't that abstract a concept to understand. A moment please, he told the human before turning his attention to the pad in his hand, this time not merely for the sake of appearances. The captain typed out a message to the ship's AI as quickly as he could. List all the habitable worlds within 200 light-years of where we picked up the human. No worlds matching that criteria exist, came the reply. He thought for a moment as a deeply unsettling feeling just barely Tickled at the edges of his mind, he typed again, list all worlds that meet the following criteria: oxygen in the atmosphere, liquid water on the surface, gravity between 3 and 5 standard units, location within 200 light-years of where we found the human, one world found, RGT 9873-3A3, discovered by Tick explorers. Its name, cried Zil-Yil Isk, translates to loss of sanity. And broken blue with hope, abandoned. This world is not habitable, he typed. He knew damn well what the answer to that was. No. RGT 9873A3 is Class 12. Habitation is not possible. Galactic regulation prevents approach within 100 standard light-years. General quarantine is in effect. The captain blinked slowly and swallowed hard. He felt his heart thumping in his chest, pounding harder and faster with each passing second. His hands began to shake, and his legs felt loose. A sickening sinking weight grew in the pit of his stomach. He took a deep breath, blinked again, and turned his data pad off. He wanted the screen locked. If the inevitable came out of nowhere, his sidearm weighed heavily at his side. He dare not even look at it. It would only get him killed faster. Life harboring worlds were graded on a scale for habitability to sentient life. A Class 1 world was a perfect garden world. Class 2 worlds might have chilly weather. His own world was considered rather austere, good for developing a tough and hardy people. It was Class 5. Class 6 worlds were tough places that few visited. Some of the fiercest warrior peoples came from them. They got worse as the numbers went up. There was only one race participating in the galactic community from a Class 8 world, and most people avoided them at all costs. From there they became even harsher and more hazardous to sentient life, all the way up to Class 10 worlds, which were considered uninhabitable. Death world sentience could not come from a death world, of course. Just because something had never happened before didn't mean it could never happen. He just wished it hadn't happened on his ship. He needed another idea, something he could actually use. He might be able to think of a way to fool it, to take advantage of its current willingness to cooperate in order to eliminate it as a threat. That meant a battle of wits with a being whose race had intelligence as its only natural weapon, an intelligence that allowed them to evolve, survive, thrive, and like most sentients dominate on its home world, and that home world was a death world. They were all going to die painfully. I agree with your assessment, thank you, he typed to Jinta, wondering if it would be his last message. Better to go out with some sense of satisfaction before tomorrow. I need you to clean out the waste chutes in all the slave quarters. Yes, all of them. Despite his almost complete inability to think of anything beyond getting the hells out of there, one more idea pressed its way into his forebrain, only because he had already been toying with the notion earlier. He just had to calm himself and maintain enough control to carry it out. It wasn't going to be pretty, but it was probably the only thing Antic Toon could do to keep himself, his ship, and most of his merchandise in one piece. If the night beast somehow died, it was only a financial loss. He would be in debt to his investor, maybe sold into slavery if he had to default, but he'd be alive. He might even be able to buy his way out of it eventually. On the other hand, if the human died, he would build a shrine to the 5 lords of heaven regardless of the outcome. He saw no other choice. I want to give you a tour of the ship, he smoothly told the creature. How does that sound? Yeah, sure, said the thing. The captain swallowed his sigh of relief. Together they walked from deck to deck and room to room, the captain explaining briefly what each part of the ship was used for. He had to make most of it up, as he wasn't too clear on where his crew did what they did, or why, or how they did it. For their part, the crew were thankfully silent as the odd pair walked about, knowing better than to ask questions. Either that or they were too put off by the rumors of the human that were doubtlessly already spreading. Though he showed the crew quarters, the captain made sure to avoid the standard slave cells amidships that would have raised too many questions. As for the special slave cell they were going to visit, that one, now I noticed there are dozens of different species represented here, said the cheerful human. As they walked, I talked to your executive officer about it earlier. It's wonderful, you know, a whole galactic community up here just waiting for humanity to join. The creature seemed so earnest to Anton, but at the same time he couldn't help feeling like it was onto his ruse, and was implying a veiled threat. He could imagine it smiling as it happily slaughtered its way through every living thing aboard, all the while saying how much it wanted to meet his whole community. Oh yes, there are more than a few races aboard, the captain agreed. We cannot wait for a people as nice as you to join us either. In fact, as a representative of your people, I think it's extremely important that you meet all of the races of the galactic community. I can't do much about the ones we don't have aboard here. How many are there other races in the galaxy? The captain's pace staggered. Was it normal for this creature's people to interrupt, or was it trying to throw him off? Well, I don't know for sure, he replied slowly. What about on this ship? 26 different races, I believe, he replied, though The numbers changed so frequently, in truth he had no idea, but the thing had said he'd seen dozens aboard, so the human nodded, and they continued on their way. As I was saying, it will be important when you return to your kind to have fully interacted with as many different races of people as possible. There is someone special I want you to meet. How is your night vision? The captain asked, opening a door to a darkened room. At the base of a large ramp, Captain Antkun held his breath. The thing's next answer would doom him or save him. Not good, he said. Why? He thanked every god, lord, and demon he could think of. Because we're going in here to say hello, he said, gesturing for the human to enter the pitch-black cargo hold. As the human entered, Antikun remained a pace behind. It's dark in here because she's nocturnal. She won't mind being woken up to meet you, though. No, not at all. Let me find a light switch. 1 second. Where is it? Maybe over here. The cargo bay door slammed shut in front of him with a reverberating thud, trapping the human on the other side with the night beast. Arenes awoke with a start. The takers were back. She was sure of it before she even opened her eyes. Back to inflict more misery. After they took her the first time they came to her cell, they brought her a prisoner's ration, the hand-sized portion she supposed was meant to last a full night. They gave her a thin, pasty, foul-smelling gruel made from nothing but roots and leaves. It barely filled her stomach for a time, and did little else. She could probably digest a tenth of it. Perhaps they'd stopped feeding her after that night, instead coming only to talk then scream at her. They offered more gruel for cooperation. When she had refused to respond, they tormented her with water as freezing as a stream from the high country and more forceful than the western Patana River. By the third day she was weak and delirious with hunger. She would have killed them had she the chance. To be sure, not only would their behavior have warranted death, were they her own kind, but these were the monsters of her childhood. Everyone in her land had been taught about the takers since the time they were children. Never travel, play, or hunt alone. They said they will find you and steal you away, never be heard from again. If you're lucky, they said they will kill you before they take you, and only your body will be lost if they killed you, and in the sky your immortal soul would be doomed to wander from star to star, searching for home. Only one person had ever gotten away from them, and Arenes was no Martian captain. General Ilman. She remembered seeing her orations as a young girl and hearing all the stories. She remembered rolling her eyes, not just thinking but knowing they were fables and tales of fancy meant to keep children from getting lost or hurt by the Almighty. How wrong she was. One thing she did not expect, however, was that she would have to eat her childhood monsters just to survive. That was unexpected. The worst part was how they upset her stomach honestly and tasted of 6 different kinds of foulness. Still suffering from indigestion and ill humors had to be better than starving to death or going blind from lack of meat. It wasn't an ideal solution. The things were tall but terribly skinny, and most had thick layers of fur or feathers that meant there wasn't much food to be had. Perhaps enough good meat on each for 3 steak pie suppers, and from the gristle maybe another 2 blocks of head cheese, or a dozen rings of black pudding. That was the best case scenario, but quite a bit of the leftovers had started to turn. She of course had to dine without the benefit of a proper butcher's preparations. Part of her wondered if that made her a cannibal, but the rest of her didn't give a damn. She was mad with hunger when she accidentally killed the first one, hungrier when she ate it, and knew she would be hungry again when she killed its friends. Were they people just because they could talk? She doubted it. They didn't look like people. They looked like scared cattle or seafood that could walk. Would she have eaten a talking fish if she was hungry enough? Apparently so. He shrugged. Or don't, but then you'll just distract me. The corners of her mouth began to creep up. She couldn't tell if he was joking or serious. Either way, it made her smile just a bit. She grimaced as she began pulling the garment on, agony racking her entire body. With each movement he took note of the trouble she was having and began to help her, to add to the indignity of losing in single combat to a man, and doing so wearing little more than what the Almighty gave her on the day she had been born. She was having to rely on him to dress her using one of her own claws. He cut open the head hems at the legs of his garment, the better to fit her larger feet, sliding it on past her buttocks. He helped her arms inside, fastened it up, and patted her sides softly. All set, he said. It could have been worse, she supposed. Pretending he was her personal servant made it a little easier, which she noted as she felt the fine fabric, decorated with sigils and coats of arms, was definitely not the case. This gentleman was nobody's servant. Have you a title? She asked him, admiring one of his sigils. I thought I heard you mention one. Like yours, Dame Commander. Yes, from your inflection when we made introductions I gathered you are Stephen of House McLaren. I thought Lieutenant Colonel might be a title. The short answer is no, meaty. But how about we talk about this later, he said quietly. She followed his eyes as he looked from the speaking indentation in the wall and back to her. I have plenty of questions. About this place, and I'm sure you may have some questions for me perhaps once we get out of here. She gave a curt nod. Of course the warden was listening here. The expression was to be taken literally. The walls actually did have ears. Can you see and hear? She asked. None of the others. The monsters. Can you looked blind when you first got here and now you can see the hole from where the warden speaks. Well, I can't see too well at all, he said. But when I got here I couldn't see a thing. My eyes needed time to adjust. He leaned close, his body hovering just over hers. We are getting out of here, he whispered in her ear. How she breathed into his much smaller one. We figure the rest out, he said, but I wouldn't worry. A soft sound came from the far wall, like metal on metal. Both her and Stephen turned to the noise. A small hatch, which she knew from experience to be an embrasure, had opened across the room. With all her remaining, but not insignificant strength, she lunged for Stephen, grabbing him about the midsection and pulling him to the ground next to her. In one swift motion she climbed atop him, lying flat, and did her best to cover as much of him as possible. Don't move, she hissed in his ear. Moments passed with not a single sound escaping between them or from anywhere else. Why, he whispered. She felt his hands move to her sides as if to move her off him, but they remained in place. Confused, she shifted her gaze from side to side, then slowly turned her head to look up, and behind them the hatch had closed. Sorry, I thought they were going to loose arrows at us, she replied softly. She didn't immediately register that she should probably remove herself from the gentleman. She thought it as much his own fault. He should have said something but didn't for whatever reason. When she did roll off him she felt a subtle but distinct loss. After so long with not a single kind interaction or touch from another living soul, it had actually felt nice. Stephen, whom she hadn't thought of as anything but her own countryman since she awoke, had just reminded her of what she'd been doing without. Not only that, but just having him with her in confinement as someone of a similar mind and goals, someone to work with, gave her hope. Though a man, he even made her feel safe and secure. Don't do that again, he whispered. She grinned, and more than a little hurt. She was about to apologize and explain herself when he continued. You need to save your strength, he whispered. You're still hurt from our fight, and I can probably take an arrow better than you anyway. Arena's present condition had little to do with her match with Stephen, from which the pain, breathing issues, and dizziness had largely remitted, and everything to do with her virtually depleted and generally unsatisfactory food supply. She was not recovering her spent energy nearly as fast as she should have been, on top of the fact that she had been terribly weak to begin with. As for who should protect whom, he was still a man, and his arm could attest to the fact that his skin could rebuff arrows no better than hers. She was about to contest both his absurd notions when she noticed something that hadn't been there a moment before. There is something on the step of that embrasure, she whispered in his ear, nodding in that direction. The what, he replied softly. The arrow slit with the hatch, she clarified. He followed her gaze, a questioning finger pointing towards the small concave fixture. She nodded. Standing, he appeared nonchalant as he approached the object, palmed it, and returned to her side, keeping it close between their chests. They examined it together. Roughly as long as the breadth of her hand, the object appeared to be a cylindrical container of some sort. Trying and opening the pressed-on lid, she extracted the contents, an unnaturally smooth piece of white vellum as long as the container, and rolled neatly to fit inside. Unfurling it, she could see a set of simple illustrations like a child's hasty drawings. I don't get it, Stephen said. These are stick figures, two people. I can tell one is you and the other is me. What are these things? Arrows, the kind they use here, Arenas replied. She pointed to the third drawing where both their figures were struck like game, odd tubular arrows jutting from their backs. When they hit you they put you to sleep. Except she examined the fourth drawing where their figures were on the ground with the arrows sticking in them, then the fifth where the arrows had been removed, but the figures were still on the ground. The sixth had 12 hash marks time, she supposed, and in the seventh and final illustration their figures remained unmoved still. Except this time they mean to kill us, she finished. The sun blazed high in the sky, heat shimmering over the endless expanse of golden sands. Jalen wiped sweat from his brow, his simple African dress sticking to his skin as he trudged forward beside him. Jinta moved with practiced ease, her gaze sharp, scanning the dunes ahead. Behind them the slavers' camp burned, smoke curling into the sky, a grim reminder of their narrow escape. They had freed the captives, their cries of gratitude still echoing in Jalen's ears, but they had little time to celebrate their victory. The desert was vast, the slavers relentless, and the journey far from over. Jalen glanced at Jinta. She had been one of them, once taken from her home, forced into servitude. Now she led them through the dunes, her steps sure, her spirit unbroken, her hands clenched and unclenched at her sides, a silent testament to the rage she still carried. Ahead the ground sloped downward revealing an oasis. The water gleamed under the relentless sun, palm trees offering shelter. Jinta picked up her pace motioning for Jalen to follow. They reached the water kneeling to drink its coolness, a blessed relief. Jalen's eyes flickered toward the horizon. Dark shapes moved against the sand, his breath hitched. Slavers mounted and armed. Jinta swore, grabbing Jalen's arm. We have to move now. Jalen nodded, gripping the hilt of the blade he had taken from their camp. His heart pounded in his chest. They ran, the desert stretching endlessly before them, each step a battle against exhaustion and fear. The enemy forces pressed forward, relentless and overwhelming. Bullets and energy blasts filled the air, creating a deafening storm of destruction. Max dove behind a fallen piece of debris, his breathing ragged as he reloaded his weapon with trembling hands. We can't hold this position much longer, shouted Jalen, crouched beside him, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. Max wiped his forehead and peeked over the cover, spotting the advancing enemy troops. Then we push forward. Sitting here gets us killed. With a nod, Jalen tightened his grip on his rifle. Together, they surged from cover, firing as they moved. Explosions rocked the battlefield, shaking the ground beneath them. The enemy, though numerous, began to falter under their unyielding assault. A sudden, ear-splitting roar filled the air as an enemy mech powered up, its heavy frame casting a long shadow over them. Max barely had time to react before it unleashed a barrage of gunfire, forcing them to dive for safety. Jalen rolled to his feet, pulling out a grenade. I'll distract it. You take the shot. Max nodded, lining up his rifle as Jalen sprinted forward, drawing the mech's attention. The machine turned, its cannons locking onto him. At the last moment, Jalen hurled the grenade, the explosion blinding the mech just as Max fired a precise shot into its exposed core. With a metallic groan, the machine collapsed in a heap of twisted steel. Breathing hard, Max clapped Jalen on the back. That was close. Jalen smirked. Too close. Now let's finish this. Why wait for us to become spacefaring? Steven asked. Jinta sighed, her expression unreadable. Because most civilizations, death-worlders or not, end up destroying themselves anyway. It's just a byproduct of progress. Life is competitive, whether carnivorous or not. Radiological weapons, environmental collapse, engineered plagues, countless worlds have perished due to their own creations. She folded her arms. One civilization even built massive solar satellite swarms to harness energy. Each political faction controlled its own set, until they weaponized them. Now, their planet is little more than an accretion disk. Steven frowned. So, suicide is more convenient than murder, even on a planetary scale. Jinta nodded. Exactly. And your people are spacefaring? He asked. Yes. And now, so are yours. That made Steven pause. It was instinctual, but he suddenly felt relieved he hadn't shared any information with the slavers. How did the captain not know who or what you were? Arenas asked. He certainly thought you were dangerous. And I suspect it didn't take him long to reach the same conclusion about Steven. Jinta exhaled sharply, a sigh, according to Steven's translator. I might as well tell you now, she said. The captain already knows enough that the wrong people could piece together the rest if he starts talking. I'm a shallow, not engineered, not artificially anyway. You colonized a death world, the captain interrupted. Shut your mouth before I shut it for you, Arenas snapped. Jinta continued, ignoring the interruption. When the shallow first left millennia ago, we did so aboard corporate-sponsored generation ships. Natural disasters, wars, and time took their toll. Many were lost to the homeworld, Garoth. My planet is almost as deadly as either of yours. We knew about the gravity, atmosphere, and climate before we left so we had generations to adapt. But history tells us that most of our ancestors perished in the years after landfall. Maybe 9 out of 10 people died. But we endured. And I am a descendant of that lineage. She shook her head slowly, staring at the floor. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper, laced with disgust. Imagine our surprise when we finally began exploring the stars again, only to learn that our resilience had marked us for extermination. Imagine my horror when slavers raided one of our farming outposts. She gestured at the former captain. That man traded a pair of sublight engines for me. I would have lived as a slave forever if I had to, anything to keep my people hidden. She exhaled sharply. Then you came along, Stephen. I couldn't let them do to you what they had done to others. Stephen's expression softened. That's why you helped me, he said. Why you told me what these guys were really about. Jinta nodded. I have to admit, though, I was a little disappointed in you. Why? You're too nice, she said with a smirk. I expected you to start a rampage much sooner. Instead, you got tricked into the cargo hold. Stephen scratched his head. Yeah. I think I see where you're going with this. What am I missing? Arenas asked, confused. She orchestrated this, anti-spat, pointing at Jinta. She pointed me in the right direction, knowing I'd realize Stephen was a death worlder. She wanted me to try to kill him. Stephen glanced at the weapon he had thrown earlier before looking back at the slavers. He mulled it over. Killing them would be one way to handle things, but not the best way. It's possible to imprison them on one of our worlds, Stephen said. We can inform our governments and let them decide. Jinta placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. It's the only way to keep our kind safe. Her grip tightened slightly. You must understand that. He felt a strong discomfort creeping in. Between her touch, the closeness of her imposing bulk, and the strength he had seen in those legs, he wondered whether punching a rampaging horse would be a good idea. We vote, Arenas said. Then we abide by the captain's decision. Jinta sighed. Fine. I vote they stand before a magistrate, Arenas said. I vote to kill them, Jinta countered. And I vote they stand trial, Stephen added. So be it. Years later, Stephen awoke to the familiar sensation of something small but incredibly energetic pouncing on his back. Daddy! Daddy! Get up, get up, get up! Sharp claws dug into his skin. He groaned, burying his face deeper into the pillow. Claws off the comforter, he mumbled. The claws retracted, replaced by bony knees, but the bouncing continued. Then, little fingers pried at his hands and pillow. Daddy, stop playing. It's time to get up. I have a surprise for you. Stephen grunted. Based on the smell alone, he could already guess what it was. He reached to the left, hands sliding under the sheets to shake the warm figure beside him. Babe, your daughter. A sleepy groan came in response. No. Sleep. Stephen resorted to drastic measures. He rolled toward Arenas, sending their daughter tumbling onto her mother with a soft flump. Victory. Until Arenas stole his pillow and grabbed his beard, tilting his face toward her. You didn't forget what day it is, did you? She asked. Of course not, he said, stealing a kiss. 10 years today. Their daughter, Sarah, scrambled out of bed. I have a surprise, she announced, rushing out of the room. Stephen turned to Arenas. You had something to do with this, didn't you? She smirked. Maybe. Moments later, Sarah returned with her little brother, Aganon. The boy carried a tray laden with various raw meats, presenting it proudly to his mother. Such a dignified young gentleman, Arenas praised, ruffling his hair. Stephen turned just in time to see Sarah bounding toward him, arms outstretched. Something warm and covered sat in her hands. "No peeking," she ordered, placing it in his lap. He lifted the cover. "Pancakes." Sarah grinned. "Happy anniversary, Daddy."